The council hall of the pack smelled of burning resin and old leather. Iron torches held flames against the gray stone walls, casting long shadows over the banners of the 5 packs that hung from the vaulted ceiling, embroidered cloth bearing wolves in positions of dominance, each in different colors, each representing centuries of blood and hierarchy. Ruby had known those symbols since childhood. Her mother had drawn them in the dirt with a branch when she was too young to read, speaking the names in a low voice, as though they were words too sacred to be said at full volume. This night was not meant for her. That was what Ruby had told herself while Sina tightened the ribbon at the end of her long golden braid, knotting it with her teeth and exhaling with satisfaction. "Perfect," Sina had said, stepping back to assess the result with half-closed eyes. "You look like a noble." "Almost." "Almost," Ruby had repeated, without smiling. Sina had been her companion since they were 7 years old, when the two of them shared a narrow bed in the Omega quarters of Ashford Village. Sina had dark hair and a mouth that rarely stayed quiet, and she had spent nearly an hour insisting that Ruby wear the new gray cloak instead of the old faded brown one. "You are walking into the Grand Council Hall, not a stable," she had said. "Wear the cloak like you belong there." Ruby had worn the gray cloak, but belonging there was another matter entirely. She had not been invited to the Pack Council as a representative of anything. She had been summoned, a different word, a different weight, by the messenger of the Dawnridge Pack, who had brought a scroll of parchment bearing Lord Cedric's dark red wax seal and a single line written inside. "Your presence is required in the council hall on the night of the gathering moon. You will serve as interpreter of ancient records." Interpreter of ancient records. That was what they called Ruby when they wanted to use the fact that she could read, a rare thing among the Omegas of Ashford, without having to acknowledge that she was anything more than a servant with elegant handwriting. Cedric had promised other things as well, over the past 2 years. He had promised that her lineage would be registered in the Dawnridge Pack's record house, that she would receive a minor title of affiliation, that her position would be formalized before the next gathering moon. He had promised these things in a low voice, when no one was listening, in the corridors of Dawnridge House where Ruby worked as a scribe. And she had believed him, because Cedric had gentle green eyes and a voice that sounded like reason. She had been a fool. She discovered this the moment she crossed the double oak doors of the Grand Hall, and saw Cedric standing beside the central table, his hand resting on the shoulder of Isolde Varn, daughter of the Lord of the Varn Pack. Red hair, a burgundy velvet gown, a smile that knew precisely what it was worth. Cedric did not see her enter, or he saw her and chose not to react, which was worse. Ruby stopped in the middle of the hall. Around her, nobles from 5 packs conversed in groups, holding goblets of dark wine, wearing embroidered mantles and worked leather belts. Guards posted along the walls stared forward without expression. Servants moved through the crowd with trays. For one moment, no one paid any attention to her. A young woman in a gray cloak, standing in the center of the hall, holding a scroll of parchment that no one had asked for yet. Then Cedric turned his head. His green eyes found hers for a single second, and in that second, Ruby saw the entire truth. There was no surprise in his face. There was calculation. He had known she was coming. He had sent the messenger knowing she would come, and he had arranged for her to arrive and see exactly this. He crossed the hall toward her. Ruby did not step back. "Ruby," he said, in a voice low enough to feel private, but loud enough that those nearest could hear if they chose. "I am glad you arrived. You may leave the parchments with Scribe Aldous, there in the corner. He will handle the translations this evening." She looked at him. Then she looked at Scribe Aldous, a man of 50 whom she had personally trained for 3 months because he could not decipher the ancient dialect of the border records. "I understand," she said. "I also wish to say," he lowered his voice further, "that circumstances have changed. The alliance with the Varn family requires certain formalities, certain choices. You understand?" "I understand," said Ruby again. Cedric seemed mildly uncomfortable with her lack of reaction. He had expected tears, perhaps, or anger, or pleading. Ruby felt all of those things moving inside her like water boiling beneath a lid. But the lid was firm, and she had learned from an early age that Omegas who weep in public pay for it in ways that take years to heal. "You are welcome to stay for the banquet if you wish," he offered, as though presenting a kindness. "That will not be necessary," Ruby replied. She gave a slight bow, turned, and began walking toward the doors. The parchments were still under her arm. No one had asked for them back, and she did not offer them. They were her work. Her only work now. The hall was long. Each step felt longer than the last, but she kept her chin raised and her shoulders level, and if tears were pressing behind her eyes, they would have to wait for the cold outside. That was when the voice cut through the air of the hall like a blade. "Hold the doors." It was not a shout. It was the kind of voice that has no need to shout because the world has long since learned to obey it. Low, absolutely calm, and carrying the weight of someone who had never once in their life needed to repeat a command. Ruby stopped. The entire hall stopped. She turned slowly. At the top of the stone staircase that led to the upper level of the hall, the level reserved for those of highest rank, stood a woman. Tall, with hair as white as snow pinned in a severe coil, black robes with silver embroidery along the sleeves, and eyes that were the precise color of a storm before it breaks. She descended the steps with the ease of someone who owns time itself. With each step, the nobles around her opened space, not out of courtesy, but out of something older and more instinctive than courtesy. Ruby did not need an introduction to know who this woman was. Lady Seraphine, mother of Alpha King Tristan of the Kingdom of Varenhold, the woman who had ruled as regent for 6 years following the death of the previous king, before her son came of age. The woman of whom it was said that no Alpha dared raise his voice in her presence, not even the eldest members of the council. No one had told Ruby that Lady Seraphine would be present at the council tonight. The woman descended the final steps and walked directly through the silent hall, directly toward Ruby. Ruby stayed where she was. There was nowhere to go, and running would be worse than facing whatever was coming. Lady Seraphine stopped less than 2 paces away. Her storm-gray eyes moved slowly downward, assessing the gray cloak, the golden braid, the parchments tucked under the arm, then rose back to Ruby's face with an expression that was neither cruelty nor kindness, but something more surgical than either. "You are Cedric's scribe," said Lady Seraphine. It was not a question. "I was," answered Ruby, before she could think better of it. Something passed through Lady Seraphine's eyes. It was not surprise. "Your name?" "Ruby, my lady. Of Ashford." "Ashford," the woman repeated, and there was a strange weight in that word, as though she recognized it from a place Ruby could not begin to imagine. "Of which clan?" "Of none, my lady. I am an unaffiliated Omega." The silence that followed was of a different kind from the silence before. This one had more tension in it. Ruby could feel the gaze of everyone in the hall like physical pressure against her skin, but she did not look away from Lady Seraphine's eyes, because looking away meant showing her throat, and she had promised herself years ago that she would never show her throat to anyone again. Lady Seraphine opened her mouth to speak, and then it happened. Ruby never knew where the word came from. She had not planned to say it. She barely knew she carried it. She had read it in one of the ancient parchments weeks ago, a fragment of text in Proto-Wolf dialect that she had transcribed with careful hands, without fully understanding its meaning, only knowing that it was very old and very serious. The word had stayed in her memory the way certain things do, without invitation, without apparent purpose. But when Lady Seraphine opened her mouth, something in the woman's posture, something in the way she was preparing what would clearly be a dismissal, a disregard, One more rejection in a night already full of them made the word rise through Ruby's throat as though it had always belonged there. Verexol, said Ruby. The silence that followed was not silence. It was the complete absence of sound, as though the very air inside the hall had forgotten how to move. Lady Seraphine went entirely still. And then, for the first time in a night full of humiliations and dismissals, Ruby saw something she had not expected to see on any face in that hall. She saw fear. The fear on Lady Seraphine's face lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by something Ruby found far more difficult to read, a controlled stillness, the kind worn by people who have spent decades mastering the art of revealing nothing. But those 3 seconds had been real. Ruby had seen them. And from the ripple of unease that moved through the nearest nobles like wind through wheat, she understood that she was not the only one. Lady Seraphine took one slow breath. "Where?" she said, and her voice had dropped to something almost private, almost careful. "Did you learn that word?" Ruby glanced down at the parchment still tucked beneath her arm. From the Dawnridge Border Records, Volume 7 of the Ashford Territorial Archives. The text was written in Proto-Wolf dialect, and the word appeared in a passage describing the rights of— "I did not ask what passage," Lady Seraphine said quietly. "I asked where you learned it." "I just told you, my lady." "You read it from a page of parchment," the woman said slowly, as though confirming something to herself rather than to Ruby. "And you pronounced it correctly." It was not phrased as a remarkable thing, but the way Lady Seraphine said it made Ruby understand that it was, in fact, deeply remarkable, because several of the nobles nearby had shifted in place, and the 2 guards flanking the main staircase had exchanged a look they clearly thought no one noticed. Ruby straightened slightly. "I have always had an ear for old dialects, my lady. I transcribe them as accurately as I can." Lady Seraphine looked at her for a long moment. Then she did something that no one in the hall seemed to expect, least of all Ruby. She stepped aside and extended one hand toward the staircase. "Come," she said. "There is something I wish to show you." The hall did not erupt into noise. It was too trained for that, but the quality of the silence shifted, from stunned to uncertain, the kind of silence that holds its breath because it does not yet know what it is witnessing. Ruby did not move immediately. Every reasonable instinct she possessed told her that following the mother of the Alpha King up a stone staircase in the middle of the gathering council was not a wise decision for an unaffiliated Omega from Ashford. But there was a secondary instinct, older, quieter, the kind she had learned to distrust because it rarely led anywhere comfortable and almost always led somewhere true, that told her she had already crossed whatever threshold she was going to cross the moment she had spoken that word aloud. She followed Lady Seraphine up the stairs. The upper level of the council hall was a gallery that ran the length of the room, lined with carved wooden balustrades and lit by iron candelabras. But Lady Seraphine did not stop at the gallery. She led Ruby through a narrow door at the far end, into a corridor of plain stone, and then into a small antechamber that smelled of old wood, candle wax, and something else, something that Ruby's instincts catalogued before her mind did, a scent like pine resin and cold iron, specific and unmistakable. The scent of high-ranking wolf. Very high-ranking. Ruby slowed her pace just slightly. There were 2 men already in the antechamber. The first stood near the window, leaning against the stone wall with his arms crossed, and an expression of mild amusement that suggested he found most things in the world entertaining in a way he could not quite be bothered to explain. He was lean, dark-haired, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow and a cloak of deep green draped carelessly over one shoulder. He looked at Ruby with open curiosity, the way someone looks at a puzzle they have just decided to find interesting. "Well," he said, to no one in particular. That was not on the agenda for this evening. "Rolf," said Lady Seraphine without looking at him. "Be quiet." Rolf pressed his lips together and was quiet, though his eyes remained fixed on Ruby with undisguised interest. The second man was standing near the far wall, beside a table covered in rolled maps and bound ledgers. He was not leaning. He was not sitting. He was simply standing, and the stillness of it was different from Lady Seraphine's trained composure. It was natural, the way a mountain is still, without effort or intention. He was very tall, with long black hair woven into tight braids that fell past his shoulders, and he wore black leather armor with crossed straps over the chest and bracers of dark leather at his forearms. There was a faint scar near the corner of his left eye that Ruby noticed only because she was looking carefully, the way she always looked at old texts, searching for the mark that told her what something truly was. His eyes were the color of deep water in winter, blue, but not bright, the kind of blue that exists far below the surface. He was looking at her, not the way the nobles in the hall below had looked at her, with assessment or dismissal or idle curiosity. He was looking at her the way she had looked at him a moment ago, carefully, and with the specific attention of someone who already knew that what they were seeing mattered, and was working out exactly why. Ruby recognized him the same way she had recognized Lady Seraphine. There was no other man in the 5 kingdoms who could stand in a room and make the air around him feel slightly more serious simply by being present in it. Alpha King Tristan of Varenhold. Ruby did the only appropriate thing, which was to drop into a deep and immediate bow, her eyes going to the floor, the parchments nearly slipping from under her arm. "My king," she said. "Rise," said Lady Seraphine, before Tristan could speak. Ruby rose. She kept her gaze carefully at the level of his collarbone. The way she had been taught was proper when addressing royalty. Tristan said nothing for a moment. She could feel his attention on her the way you feel the warmth of a fire, not painfully, but with a certainty that could not be ignored. "You spoke a word downstairs," said Lady Seraphine, settling into a chair near the candelabra with the ease of someone returning to their own home. "Varexol. Do you know what it means?" "Not precisely, my lady," Ruby said honestly. "The passage I found it in was partially damaged. The surrounding text described a formal declaration of, I believed it was a declaration of ancestral standing, or perhaps of blood right. But the full meaning was unclear." "The full meaning," said Lady Seraphine, "is considerably more specific than blood right. Then I would be grateful to be corrected." Something shifted in the room. Ruby did not know what it was, only that it had to do with her last answer, and that both Rolf near the window and Lady Seraphine near the candelabra had reacted to it in ways too small for most people to catch. Tristan finally spoke. His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who chooses words the way a craftsman chooses tools, deliberately and without waste. "Varexol," he said, "is a word from the first language of the wolf packs. It predates every written record in Varenhold by at least 4 centuries. It means, approximately, I recognize the blood that was promised. It is spoken." He paused. "Only by those who carry the bloodline of the founding clans. It cannot be learned. It cannot be imitated. When it is spoken by someone who does not carry that blood, it sounds wrong. Hollow." Ruby processed this carefully. "And when I said it? It did not sound hollow," said Lady Seraphine quietly. The candle flames held still. The stone walls offered nothing. Ruby stood in the middle of the antechamber with old parchments under her arm and a gray cloak that Sina had insisted upon and understood, in the particular way you understand things that are going to change everything. That tonight was not going to end the way she had imagined it when she crossed the oak doors of the council hall. "My mother," said Tristan, "has not heard that word spoken correctly in 31 years. Ruby looked at Lady Seraphine then. The woman was watching her with those storm-gray eyes, and the fear that had appeared for 3 seconds in the hall below was not gone after all. It was still there, only it had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of something dangerous. It was the fear of something lost, suddenly found. 31 years, Ruby said slowly. And then, because the number had pulled at something in the back of her mind, like a thread she had not known was loose. That is exactly how old I am. The silence that answered her was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Rolf pushed off from the wall near the window. He was no longer smiling. And Tristan, who had not moved once since she entered the room, finally moved. One step forward, nothing more. But the weight of it was enough to make the air in the antechamber feel entirely different. "Sit down," he said to Ruby, and his voice had not changed in tone, but something beneath it had. "This is going to take some time." There was a single wooden chair near the table covered in maps. Ruby sat in it the way she sat in most situations that frightened her, with her back straight and her hands folded over the parchments in her lap, presenting the appearance of composure while everything underneath it worked very hard to remain in place. The candelabra cast warm light across the stone walls of the antechamber, and outside the narrow window, the night had deepened into the particular blue-black that preceded the rising of the full moon. Lady Seraphine remained in her chair near the candles. Rolf had settled onto the edge of the table, earning a brief look of displeasure from Tristan that he chose to ignore, and was now watching Ruby with the focused attention of someone who has just decided that a situation is significantly more interesting than anything else he might otherwise be doing. Tristan himself stood with his back to the window, arms at his sides, the moonlight beginning to edge over his shoulder as the night progressed. "I will tell you what I know," said Lady Seraphine, "and you will tell me what you remember. We will see where the two accounts meet." Ruby nodded once. 32 years ago, Lady Seraphine began. My husband, King Aldrich of Varenhold, entered into a treaty with the clan of Ashenvale. You will not find that name in any current record of the 5 packs, because Ashenvale no longer exists as a formal clan. It was dissolved. She paused. Or rather, it was destroyed. The words settled over the room like ash. Ashenvale, Ruby said carefully, was one of the founding clans. Lady Seraphine's eyes sharpened. You know of it. I read of it, once in a fragment. It appeared alongside the word I spoke tonight, in the same damaged passage. I assumed the clan had simply faded over time, as smaller clans sometimes do. It did not fade, said Lady Seraphine. It was eliminated. Systematically, over the course of 4 years, by a coalition of 3 rival clans who feared what Ashenvale carried. What did it carry? The oldest bloodline in the known wolf territories, said Tristan, from the window. His voice was neutral, the way deep water is neutral. Ashenvale's founding alpha was present at the first Accord of Pax nearly 6 centuries ago. Their blood carried abilities that had not appeared in any other clan for generations. The other clans called it a myth. But myths have a way of making people afraid, and afraid people make poor decisions. The Alpha of Ashenvale. At the time of the destruction, Lady Seraphine continued, had 1 daughter. She was 23 years old. When it became clear that the clan would not survive the siege, she was taken from Ashenvale by 2 of the clan's eldest warriors and hidden. The treaty my husband signed was meant to guarantee her safety. She was brought into our protection under a false name and settled in a village far from any pack territory where her scent would not be recognized. Ruby's hands had gone very still on the parchments. That village, she said, and her own voice had taken on a quality she did not entirely recognize. Was it Ashford? Lady Seraphine did not answer immediately. She looked at Ruby with those storm-colored eyes for a long moment, and then she said, Yes. The candle flames moved, though there was no wind. My mother, Ruby said slowly, was named Ilara. She died when I was 9. She never spoke of any clan. She told me my father was a traveling merchant who had not stayed. She told me we were unaffiliated because her own parents had been unaffiliated before her, and there was no record worth claiming. She told you what would keep you safest, said Lady Seraphine, not unkindly. A child who knows nothing cannot reveal anything, even under pressure. There was pressure? There were inquiries, said Tristan. In the years following Ashenvale's fall, the clans responsible for its destruction sent searchers into the outer villages. They were looking for survivors, specifically for the Alpha's daughter. My grandmother, Ruby said. Your grandmother, confirmed Lady Seraphine, who died in Ashford when you were approximately 3 years old, according to our records. She had lived under the name of a common herb woman. No one found her. A pause. And when she died, the protection of her bloodline passed entirely to her daughter, to your mother, who was already gone 2 years before we learned of it. Ruby exhaled slowly. You were watching Ashford. We maintained a quiet watch on it for many years, said Lady Seraphine. When your mother died, we believed the line had ended with her. You were a child. There was no record of a daughter, no birth record registered with any pack authority. Your mother had been thorough. She was, Ruby said quietly. Her mother had been thorough about many things, about keeping the firewood stacked precisely, about teaching Ruby to read from texts that most Omega children never touched, about saying certain words aloud in the dark of their small house when she thought Ruby was asleep, words that Ruby had stored without understanding, the way a child stores everything that feels important before they have the language to explain why. Words like Varexel. She taught you the old language without telling you what it was, said Rolf, who had been uncharacteristically quiet for several minutes. He said it without accusation, with something closer to careful wonder. She taught me sounds, Ruby said. She called it a game. Said certain old words had music in them that was worth learning even if the meaning was lost. I thought she simply loved old things. She collected fragments of old texts. She paid for them with work when she had no coin. She was preserving what she could, said Lady Seraphine. She was preserving me, Ruby corrected, and the truth of it arrived with a weight that pressed against the back of her throat in a way that had nothing to do with the evening's earlier humiliations. This was older and deeper and entirely different. She spent her whole life making sure I would survive without ever telling me what I was surviving for. The room held that thought in silence for a moment. Then Tristan moved away from the window. He crossed to the table, standing at the opposite end from where Rolf sat, and looked down at the rolled maps with the expression of someone who has been working through the logistics of a problem and has arrived at the part that requires a decision. The clans that destroyed Ashenvale, Ruby said, because her mind had begun moving in the direction it always moved when she was working through old texts. Forward, toward the implication she had not yet named. Are they still active? 2 of the 3 are, said Tristan. He did not look up from the maps. The 3rd collapsed under its own internal conflicts 40 years ago. The remaining 2 hold seats on the Gathering Council. They are represented in the hall below this room at this moment. Ruby looked at the floor beneath her feet. Which means, she said carefully, that my being here tonight, speaking that word in front of witnesses, in a hall full of pack nobles, was either the worst possible timing, said Rolf, or the best possible timing, depending entirely on what we decide to do in the next few hours. What you decide, Ruby said, looking between the 3 of them. This is my blood and my history, and I have spent 31 years not knowing any of it, which means I have a voice in whatever comes next. Another silence. This one was different from all the others. It had a quality of assessment to it, as though the room itself was evaluating her. Lady Seraphine smiled. It was not a large smile, but it reached her storm-gray eyes, and it was the first completely unguarded expression Ruby had seen on her face since the hall below. "Yes," said Lady Seraphine simply. "You do." Tristan finally looked up from the maps. His winter blue eyes found Ruby's across the table and held there, steady and direct, with the same careful attention he had given her since she walked into this room. "The question," he said, "is not whether you have a voice. The question is whether you are willing to use it. Because once Ashenvale's bloodline is formally declared before the council, there is no quiet path afterward. The clans below will know what they failed to finish, and they will not ignore it." Ruby thought about Cedric's green eyes full of calculation. She thought about Scribe Aldous, whom she had trained, sitting in her seat below with her work in his hands. She thought about her mother's voice in the dark, saying old words like music, making sure something survived. She thought about the word that had risen in her throat without permission, as though it had simply been waiting for the right moment to be spoken. "I have been quiet my entire life," Ruby said. "My mother was quiet her entire life. Her mother was quiet until the clan around her was destroyed for something it carried in its blood." She set the parchments carefully on the edge of the table. "I am done being quiet," she said. Outside the narrow window, the full moon had risen above the tree line, flooding the stone walls of Varenhold's council hall with silver light. Below, the gathering council continued without knowing what was being decided above its head. And in the antechamber, something that had been buried for 31 years drew its first full breath. The plan took shape the way good plans always do, not with grand declarations, but with quiet, precise decisions made by people who understood exactly what was at stake. Tristan spread 3 of the maps across the table and weighted their corners with iron candle holders, and for the next hour he spoke in the measured, unhurried manner that Ruby was beginning to recognize as simply how he thought, without excess, without performance, every word carrying exactly the weight he intended it to carry and no more. Rolf contributed ideas in quick bursts, occasionally earning a flat look from Tristan, when the ideas veered toward the unnecessarily complicated. And Lady Seraphine sat in her chair near the candles and listened to everything with the particular quality of attention that Ruby associated with people who have already seen how most stories end and are checking the current one for familiar patterns. Ruby listened to all of it and said very little, because she was doing what she had always done with new texts, reading the shape of things before committing to an interpretation. What she understood, by the time the moon had climbed higher and the noise from the hall below had settled into the quieter register of a banquet entering its later hours, was this: formally declaring the survival of Ashenvale's bloodline before the gathering council required witnesses of sufficient rank, a declaration spoken in the old tongue, and the presentation of proof that the blood was genuine. The first 2 could be arranged. The third was the difficulty. "There is a bloodstone," said Lady Seraphine when they arrived at this point. It was one of 3 artifacts belonging to Ashenvale's founding clan. When it is held by someone of true Ashenvale blood, it responds. There is no way to counterfeit the response. Every pack elder in that hall below knows this, because the bloodstones were witnessed and documented at the first accord of packs. "Where is it?" said Ruby. Lady Seraphine looked at her steadily. "It has been in Varenhold's keeping for 31 years. My husband received it from Ashenvale's last alpha on the night the treaty was signed, as a gesture of trust." "You have been holding it," Ruby said slowly, "since before I was born." "Holding it," said Lady Seraphine, "and waiting. We did not know what we were waiting for. Only that the bloodline had not ended, because the stone had never gone dark." Ruby absorbed this. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a long chain of small things was connecting itself, the way her mother had sometimes paused at windows and looked south for no reason Ruby could name. The way she had kept a small piece of gray stone on the shelf above the fire, smooth and unremarkable, that Ruby had never thought to question because children do not question the permanent features of their world. The way that stone had vanished from the shelf the morning after her mother died, and Ruby had assumed, with the blunt practicality of a 9-year-old faced with a grief too large to hold, that someone had taken it in the general disorder of the days that followed. "My mother had one too," Ruby said. Lady Seraphine went very still. "There were 3, Rolf said from the table, his voice for the first time entirely devoid of its usual lightness. "If your mother carried one, then there is a 3rd, said Tristan. "Which the clans that destroyed Ashenvale have been searching for," Ruby finished. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the table. "For 31 years. The fire in the candelabra seemed to pull inward for a moment, as though the room had drawn a breath. "This changes the sequence," said Tristan, looking at Rolf. "It changes it considerably," Rolf agreed, and he sounded very sober now. Ruby stood. "Then we should not wait until they find it first. If the declaration is made tonight, before the council disperses, with your bloodstone as proof and whatever witnesses of rank you can gather in the next hour, the clans below cannot act against me within these walls without violating the accord themselves." All 3 of them looked at her. "You said you read the accord," said Rolf carefully. "Volume 4 of the Ashford Territorial Archives," said Ruby. "The protections granted to declared bloodlines under the Accord of Pax are binding on all signatory clans. Any action taken against a formally declared heir within the bounds of a gathering council constitutes a breach of the accord and strips the offending clan of its council seat." Rolf turned to Tristan with an expression that was somewhere between impressed and deeply amused. "I like her." Tristan did not respond to this. He was looking at Ruby with those winter blue eyes, and the careful attention she had noticed from the beginning had shifted into something more specific. Not warmer, exactly, but more present, the way a fire becomes more present when you add wood to it without increasing its noise. "You have read Volume 4 of the Ashford Territorial Archives," he said. "I have read all 12 volumes," said Ruby. "I had considerable time, and Lord Cedric's record house had an extensive collection that no one else was using." Something moved at the corner of Tristan's mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "Rolf," he said, without looking away from Ruby, "go down and find Lord Aldrin of the Westmore Pack and Elder Sova of the Greymount delegation. Tell them the king requests their presence as witnesses to a formal declaration. Do not tell them anything else. And if they ask questions, tell them the king requests their presence," Tristan repeated, in a tone that ended the conversation. Rolf went. Lady Seraphine rose from her chair and crossed to a carved wooden chest in the corner of the antechamber that Ruby had not noticed before. She opened it with a key she wore on a thin chain beneath her robes, and from inside lifted a cloth-wrapped object roughly the size of a closed fist. She carried it to the table and set it down, and then unwrapped it with the careful hands of someone handling something they have held in trust for a very long time. The stone was dark gray, smooth, and entirely unremarkable in appearance, until Lady Seraphine stepped back from it. Then, very slowly, something beneath its surface began to move. A light, deep and ember red, pulsing with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the candles around it, and everything to do with the presence of the woman standing 3 feet away from it. Ruby stared at it. "Go ahead," said Lady Seraphine quietly. Ruby reached out and picked up the bloodstone. The light did not simply intensify. It changed color, from ember red to something that sat between gold and white. A living light that moved through the stone's gray surface like sunrise moving through cloud. And it was warm in her hand, in the way that very few things in Ruby's life had ever been warm. Not the warmth of fire or of wool blankets in winter, but something older than either. The warmth of recognition, of something that has been waiting for so long that the reunion itself has become a form of grief. Ruby's eyes burned. She did not let them overflow. "It has not shown that color since the night Ashenvale's Alpha held it," said Lady Seraphine, and her voice had lost every layer of the controlled public woman and become something that Ruby recognized as the sound of a person standing in front of something they had stopped believing they would ever see. "My lady," Ruby said, her voice steady by will alone, "I need you to tell me one more thing before the witnesses arrive. Ask it. The treaty your husband signed with Ashenvale's Alpha." Ruby looked at her carefully. "What did it promise, beyond safety?" Lady Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Outside, footsteps were beginning to sound on the stone corridor beyond the antechamber door. Rolf returning with the witnesses, faster than expected. "It promised," said Lady Seraphine, "that if the bloodline survived, and if the heir came of age and was found, Varenhold would stand as formal protector of the restored clan. That the heir would be received not as a guest or a ward, but as an equal under the accord." Ruby set this alongside everything else she had learned in the past 2 hours, and felt it click into place with the particular satisfaction of a translation finally yielding its meaning. "And the king," she said, "is bound by his father's treaty." "Every king of Varenhold is bound by every treaty his predecessors signed," said Lady Seraphine. "That is the foundation of the accord." Tristan, who had been standing in silence throughout this exchange, spoke then. "I am not standing here because I am bound by a treaty," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely certain, the way the stone walls of the hall were certain, not aggressive, simply there, immovable and without need of argument. "I am standing here because what is happening in this room is right. Those are not always the same thing. Tonight they are." Ruby looked at him. He looked back at her with those deep winter blue eyes that missed nothing. And she understood something that she had not had the information to understand before this moment. That this man had known about Ashenvale, had known about the treaty, had perhaps known for some time that Ashford was where the search should lead, and had chosen to wait, for reasons that had to do with patience and certainty, rather than indifference. She wanted to ask him about it. She would, eventually. But the door opened, and Rolf entered with 2 elder wolves, whose faces carried the guarded expressions of people who have been told nothing, and are prepared for anything. And behind them came 2 of Tristan's personal guards, and the antechamber was suddenly full of people, and the particular gravity of a moment that will be spoken of afterward. Ruby set the bloodstone on the table before her, its gold-white light steady and undiminished, and straightened her shoulders inside the gray cloak that Sina had insisted upon, and understood that she was no longer the woman who had walked into the council hall tonight carrying someone else's parchments and someone else's broken promises. She was something older than that, something that had survived because her mother had been thorough, and she was done letting other people decide what that meant. The formal declaration took place in the antechamber of the council hall's upper gallery, witnessed by Lord Aldrin of Westmore, a broad, gray-bearded wolf of 60 years, whose reputation for impartiality was the most valuable thing he owned, and Elder Sova of the Greymount delegation, a small, sharp-eyed woman who had attended more gathering councils than most people in the hall below had been alive, and who looked at the glowing bloodstone on the table with the expression of someone watching a legend step out of a page of text and into the room with them. Tristan spoke the declaration in the old tongue. His pronunciation was exact and without hesitation, and Ruby, who had spent years learning to hear the difference between a correct reading and a careless one, understood that he had not learned this passage recently. He had known it for a long time, and had been waiting, with the same deliberate patience that seemed to govern everything about him, for the moment it would be needed. When he finished, he looked at Ruby. She spoke the words of acceptance in response. Lady Seraphine had shown her the passage quickly, in a small leather volume produced from the same chest as the bloodstone, and Ruby had read it once and committed it without difficulty, because some things the mind holds effortlessly when they belong to it. Her voice was clear and did not waver, and the bloodstone, which she had placed back on the table at the start of the declaration, pulsed its gold-white light steadily throughout, as though confirming each word as it was spoken. Lord Aldrin signed the witness parchment without comment. Elder Sova signed it, then held the quill for a moment after, looking at the bloodstone, and then looked at Ruby with an expression that was old and complicated and had something in it that took Ruby a moment to identify. It was relief, the kind that belongs to someone who has carried a guilt for a long time. "Greymount," Ruby said quietly, because she had read the accord, and she knew the signatory clans, and she had already assembled this piece before the woman confirmed it, was not one of the clans that destroyed Ashen Vale. "No," said Elder Sova. "We were not. We also did not stop it. That is a different sin, but it is still a sin." She set the quill down. "It is good that you are here, child." "It is good to know where I come from," Ruby replied. Rolf escorted the two witnesses back to the gallery with instructions that were quiet and very specific, and Ruby heard the word discretion used twice before the door closed. Not secrecy. The declaration was a matter of record now, witnessed and signed, and could not be unmade. But the manner of its announcement to the full council was a choice that still belonged to this room. Lady Seraphine settled into her chair again and let out a breath that was the first completely unguarded physical thing Ruby had seen her do. It made her look, briefly, like someone who had been standing for a very long time and had finally found a place to sit. "There is still the matter of the third stone," said Tristan. "I know," said Ruby. "I have been thinking about it." He waited. This, she had noticed, was something he did consistently. He asked a thing or stated a thing, and then he was silent and let the other person finish their thought without filling the space, which was rarer than it should have been, and more valuable than most people recognized. "My mother's belongings," Ruby said, "were distributed after her death by the village elder of Ashford. I was 9. I had no legal standing to claim anything, and there was not much to claim. Most of it went to the households that had helped us through the winter. But there was a woman. Her name was Dara. She had been my mother's closest friend in Ashford. She helped raise me after my mother died. Who kept a small box of things she said were too personal to give away. She told me she would hold them until I was old enough to want them. I never went back for them." "Why?" said Lady Seraphine. Ruby was quiet for a moment. "Because going back meant standing in the village where everyone had known me as nothing, and I had spent a great deal of effort becoming something else. Even a small something. Even just a scribe who could read dialects." She looked at her hands. "I told myself I would go back when it mattered enough." "It matters now," said Tristan. "Yes," said Ruby. "It does." He looked at her across the table, and there was something in that look that she did not have a clean name for. It was not pity, which she would have refused, and it was not admiration, which would have felt presumptuous this soon. But it was something in the range of both of those things, and also something quieter and more specific. The way certain words in old dialects carried meanings that had no single equivalent in common speech. "I will send a guard to Ashford with you," he said. "Rolf will. I will go myself," said Rolf from the doorway, where he had reappeared with the particular timing of someone who has been listening through the door and chose not to pretend otherwise. "Before you assign me, I am volunteering. I want to see the third stone." "You want to see what happens when she picks it up?" said Tristan flatly. "I want to see both things," said Rolf, without any trace of apology. Ruby looked at him. He was watching her with that open, unself-conscious curiosity that she had noticed from the beginning, and she decided that she did not mind it. It was honest, which was more than she could say for most of the attention she had received in her life. "Fine," she said. "But we leave at first light before the council delegates begin moving through the roads." Rolf pointed at her. "I like how she thinks." They went down to the hall. Not immediately. and not without preparation. Lady Seraphine spent a quarter of an hour speaking to Ruby in low, precise tones about what to expect, what to say if spoken to, and what to say if certain specific individuals approached her. She named 2 lords whose clan banners Ruby now identified with the knowledge of what those clans had done 31 years ago, and Lady Seraphine's instructions regarding them were simple and absolute. Say nothing, stand still, and allow Tristan to handle whatever they attempted. Ruby was not accustomed to allowing anyone to handle things on her behalf. She said so. "I know," said Lady Seraphine. "I am not asking you to be helpless. I am asking you to be strategic. There is a difference, and you are intelligent enough to understand it." Ruby understood it. They descended the stairs together. Lady Seraphine first, then Ruby, then Tristan behind her, which she understood was a deliberate positioning, and not an accident of movement. The hall below had thinned since the height of the banquet, but enough of the council remained that the shift in the room's attention was immediate and complete when they appeared on the staircase. Ruby felt it. The collective recalibration of a room full of people who were very good at reading power, suddenly confronted with an arrangement they had not anticipated and did not yet have a framework for. She kept her chin level and her hands still at her sides, and she did not look for Cedric, though she was aware of him somewhere to the left, because she had learned long ago that looking for the person who hurt you is a way of giving them continued residence in the center of your attention, and she was finished with that particular tendency. Cedric found her instead. He appeared at the edge of the crowd near the foot of the staircase, and his green eyes moved from Ruby to Lady Seraphine to Tristan, and back to Ruby with a sequence of expressions that traveled quickly through confusion, reassessment, and arrived at something that was almost, but not quite, the beginning of understanding what he had discarded. He opened his mouth. "Lord Cedric," said Tristan, without looking at him, in that quiet voice that did not need volume to fill a room. "The Dawnridge Pack's record house will receive formal correspondence from the Crown within 3 days regarding the reassignment of certain archival contracts. You will find the terms clear." Cedric closed his mouth. It was, Ruby thought, the most efficient handling of a situation she had ever witnessed. No cruelty, no theater, no prolonged moment of reversal designed to humiliate. Simply a statement of fact delivered to a man who had just understood, in the space of 30 seconds, the precise dimensions of what he had thrown away. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter and more lasting than triumph. The particular steadiness of a person who has stopped needing a specific thing and discovered that they are lighter without it. Sina was waiting outside the hall doors, wrapped in her own cloak, sitting on a stone bench in the torchlit corridor with the patience of someone who has been waiting for her best friend for most of her life and has made her peace with it. She stood the moment Ruby emerged. Her dark eyes moved over Ruby's face with the speed and thoroughness of someone reading a text they know very well, and then she looked at Lady Seraphine, and then at Tristan, and then back at Ruby. "You were gone for 2 hours," Sina said. "I know," said Ruby. "And you look entirely different than when you went in." "I know that too." Sina was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Ruby almost reached out to check if she was well. Then Sina said, in a voice that was very careful and very precise, "Do I need to pack our things?" Ruby almost smiled. "Yes, but not to leave, to stay." Sina closed her eyes briefly, the way she did when she was taking something large in through a small opening. Then she opened them and looked at Tristan with the direct, unapologetic assessment of a woman who has spent years watching someone she loves be underestimated and has developed a very low tolerance for people who might continue the pattern. Tristan met her gaze without flinching. He seemed, if anything, mildly respectful of the scrutiny. "She will not be made small here," Sina said to him. It was not a question. "No," said Tristan. "She will not." Sina looked at him for another moment, then nodded once, the way a person ratifies a treaty they have decided to trust. In the weeks that followed, Rolf rode with Ruby to Ashford at first light as promised. And Dara, older now, her hair fully grey, living in the same small house at the edge of the village, opened the door at their knock and looked at Ruby for a long moment with the eyes of a woman who has been holding something in trust and has always known this day would come. The box was cedar wood, small enough to carry in 2 hands. Inside it, wrapped in linen that still held the faint ghost of her mother's scent after all these years, was the 3rd bloodstone. Ruby held it in the yard outside Dara's house, while Rolf stood very still and said nothing, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing he had done since she met him. The stone glowed gold-white, steady and bright in the grey morning light, and Ruby stood with it for a long time, long enough to say everything she needed to say to her mother without words, which is the only language that works for certain conversations. She brought both stones back to Varenhold. The formal restoration of Ashen Vale was declared before a reconvened session of the Gathering Council 1 month after the night of the gathering moon, with all 5 packs present and the 2 stones on the table before Ruby as she spoke the declaration of restoration in the old tongue, her pronunciation exact, her voice entirely steady. The 2 lords whose clans had destroyed Ashen Vale said nothing. There was nothing to say. The accord was older than their ambitions, and a formally declared restoration was protected by every clause their own ancestors had signed. They left the council that afternoon and did not return, and the investigation that followed into their clan's historical conduct was quiet and thorough, and handled by people who were very good at that kind of work. Cedric's archival contract was reassigned. Scribe Aldous, who genuinely could not read the old dialects, was retired to lighter duties, and the position was offered to a young woman from the outer villages who reminded Ruby, in the precise angle of her determination, of herself at that age. Sena was given quarters in Varenhold's household that she declared adequate, by which she meant exceptional, and was appointed as Ruby's formal companion and household steward, a title she wore with the easy authority of someone who had been doing the work without the title for 20 years. Dara was brought from Ashford with her consent, and her herb garden replanted in the castle's south courtyard, where it flourished in the stone-walled sunlight, and where Ruby visited her every morning for the rest of her years. As for Tristan, he did not rush. He was not a man who rushed things, and Ruby was not a woman who would have welcomed it if he had. What grew between them grew the way things grow when they are not forced. Slowly, with deep roots, through a winter of careful conversations and a spring of quieter ones, through shared evenings in the castle's map room where she read old texts, and he worked through correspondence, and neither of them needed the silence to be filled. He told her eventually that he had known about Ashen Vale longer than Lady Seraphine had implied that night, that he had read his father's treaty at 15 and understood what it meant, that he had quietly maintained the watch on Ashford himself for the past 6 years, waiting for something he could not have named precisely, but would have recognized. She told him that she had spent 31 years being overlooked by people who were looking at the wrong things. "I know," he said. "I was not looking at the wrong things." She believed him. On the first anniversary of the night of the gathering moon, in the great hall of Varenhold, with the banners of all 5 packs present and the bloodstones placed on the ceremonial table, as had been done at the first accord of packs 6 centuries before, Tristan took Ruby's hand before the assembled council and made a declaration that was not required by any treaty and not demanded by any law, only by the particular certainty of a man who has waited long enough to be sure, and is sure. Ruby, last heir of Ashen Vale, keeper of the old blood, woman who had spent a lifetime being told she was nothing by people who were simply blind, said yes. Lady Seraphine, seated in the first row, permitted herself a smile that reached all the way to her storm-gray eyes and stayed there. And the word that had started everything, spoken without plan, in a moment of quiet defiance, by a woman in a gray cloak who simply refused to be dismissed one more time, turned out to be exactly what it had always been. Not an accident, a beginning.